Good morning, everybody. This is the Men's Sunday School class here at Mercy Baptist Church. My name is Robert Rathbone, and we're going to be in Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verses 1 through 20. In this chapter, we kind of saw, I guess, a little bit. Well, we really didn't get sick because we didn't really get to cover the chapters. Like chapter 1, where we see where Solomon is spending his time in Ecclesiastes here looking for the meaning of life. And so over the course of this quest or exploration, looking for what the meaning of life is, he's going to share with us in chapter 7 here some of the things he's learned during this search. And in this particular chapter, probably others, but he states some of these statements of wisdom that he's discovered. He contrasts various pairs of things that are usually opposites. Like for instance, he'll talk about the day you die versus the day you were born. And which one's better? Mourning, like going to a funeral, that type of mourning versus feasting, sorrow versus laughter. And he's going to tell us, one of these is better than the other. And what he tells us is the better one might not be what we would think, what we would expect to be. Which one is better. I mean, we know which one we would enjoy better, but he's going to tell us, this is superior to that. So before we get started, let's go to the Lord in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you again for your love, your mercy, and grace. Thank you, Lord, for salvation through the Lord Jesus Christ, through his shed blood. And I thank you, Father, for the wisdom, Lord, that you give us, Lord, through the book of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. And I just pray, Father, as we look at this chapter, I pray that you would help us to see and understand, Lord, and learn from the wisdom that you present to us, Father. So all these things we ask in the precious name of Jesus Christ. Amen. All right, in that first verse, Solomon says, "A good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of one's birth." All right, so the first statement he makes there is a good name is better than precious ointment. The word ointment there, it can mean oil, and it refers to oil that's used for medicinal purposes. Like you might rub on your skin to promote healing, to soothe maybe irritated skin or whatever. But it's medicinal. It's used in a medicinal context. And the word precious there, it means good, valuable, or beneficial. And so he says he's comparing having a good name, or that is a good reputation, to having precious ointment, or that is beneficial ointment, good ointment that can soothe. I guess that irritated skin or diseased skin or injured skin. I think they would, if a person was injured, they would pour oil on it and wrap it up. That was to help promote the healing of an injury. But here he says a good name or a good reputation. It's better to have that than even than to have a soothing ointment that you can rub on there to make you feel better. He says having a good reputation is a much better thing to have than having precious ointment. And then he says, in the day of death than the day of one's birth. And so he says the name is better than the precious ointment, and so by implication, the day of death is better than the day of one's birth. And the context here is of having a good reputation, having a good name. So it appears that he's saying, the day of one's death, if you can die with a good reputation, he says that's so much better than the day that you were born. Because once you die, if you have a good reputation, you can't make, the labor of being a good person and being righteous, and so that you would have the good name. Your labor is over with; it's done, and there's nothing you can do henceforth to tarnish your good reputation. You can't make a mistake and say, "Oh, well, I thought he was a good person, and then he does this." Well, once you're dead, your reputation's etched in stone. This is, there's nothing else you can do to improve it. You can't destroy your reputation. It's been said, it can take a lifetime to have a good reputation, but it only takes one day or even 1 hour to destroy it, because it only takes doing one bad thing that can destroy a good reputation. All right, so verse 2, he says, it's better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting, for that is the end of all men, and the living will lay it to his heart. All right, so he's saying it's better. Well, he's talking about going to the house of mourning. I guess today we would say, it's better to go to a funeral than it is to go to a banquet. The idea here, back then they didn't have funeral homes per se. They would have, I guess, kind of equivalent of wakes, where the dead body would be there, at the house, and the house would be full of mourners. They're mourning over the lost loved one. And Solomon here, he's saying it's better to go to the house of mourning than it is to go to a house of feasting, a house of banquet, where they're eating. And the idea here, it's when you go to a funeral, what's front and center? Somebody has died. It's a reminder to us that death comes to all of us. Because he says here, it's better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting. He says, for that is the end of all men. In other words, all men, the end result of men is they're going to die. We're all going to die. He says, and the living will lay it to his heart. When you go to a funeral, you come face to face with the mortality, knowing, this guy died. One day I'm going to die, and you start. It's a time to focus on your own life. How's, death's coming. I better prepare for it. This guy may or may not have been prepared for it, but it's the reality of death is smacks us in the face. And so he says the living will lay it to his heart. In other words, he'll think about, he died, I'm going to die, I better be ready for it. And so Solomon says, look, it's better to go to the house of mourning because you're thinking about reality, the reality of death. And then he says it's better to do that than to go to the house of feasting, where all you're concerned with when you go to the house of feasting is, filling your plate, filling your belly, and enjoying yourself. And death is the last thing on your mind at a banquet. And you're ignoring the reality of death. All right, verse 3, he says, sorrow is better than laughter, for by the sadness of the countenance the heart is made better. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. All right, so he says, sorrow is better than laughter. We know that given a choice, would we rather laugh or would we rather cry? Here Solomon is saying sorrow is better than laughter. He says, for by sadness of the countenance, the heart is made better. It does something for your heart that is, and he's not talking about the cardiac muscle that pumps blood through there. He's talking about sorrow forces us to get serious and to learn from the reality of whatever has happened, be it the death of a loved one or something serious has gone wrong, a problem, and you're sorrowful over it. Somebody that you care about has gotten hurt or injured or is sick or whatever it is. Sorrow makes you get serious and face reality. But laughter, on the other hand, it causes us to ignore reality. You listen to a stand-up comedian, and most of the time what they're talking about is foolish stuff. It's just foolishness, silly stuff. In fact, his or her goal is to get you to not think about reality. It's, the entertainment aspect of it is to give you a relief where you don't have to think about reality. But here is a sorrow is better than laughter, for by sadness of the countenance the heart is made better. Our heart's made better because we're thinking about reality and what we need to do, what we need to change, what we need to do different to be prepared for the future. Then he says the heart of the wise is in the house of mourning. The house of mourning is the idea. This is where people are mourning. He says, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. And mirth, of course, is laughter, levity, joking. So he says the heart of the wise. He says this is where the heart of the wise, people who are wise, this is where they think, this is where their heart is where their mind is. They're thinking about these things. He says the heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools, people who don't want to face reality, who don't want to learn from the harsh realities of life. He says they want to go to the house of mirth. They want to go where people are laughing and joking and don't want to face reality. Verse 5, he says, it is better to hear the rebuke of the wise than for a wise man to hear the song of fools. For as the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of the fool. This also is vanity. All right, so here he's comparing two things. He says, it is better to hear the rebuke of the wise. When a wise man rebukes you, it's because this wise man knows what he's talking about, and he sees, you've got a problem. You need to change. You need to, alter course. You're going in the wrong direction, and he's rebuking you because he wants to help you and correct you so that you'll be better off. And so Solomon says, look, it's better to hear the rebuke of the wise, to hear, it may be unpleasant. Between a rebuke and hearing the song, hearing a song is much more pleasurable than hearing a rebuke when somebody scolds you or tries to correct you. But Solomon says, look, it's better to hear the rebuke of the wise, somebody who knows what they're talking about, who's not leading you in the wrong direction. He says it's better to hear that than it is to hear the song of fools. And the song of fools is the enjoyment, I guess, that fools want to enjoy. They want to laugh. They want to have fun. They don't want to face reality. And apparently they don't care if you're going in the wrong direction or you're making a mistake. They probably think that's your problem, and all they want to do is make light of everything. And so the song of fools, it's something of that they sing about things that are of little value, and we don't learn a thing from their songs. But when we listen to the rebuke of the wise, we can learn something that will help us to be a better person, to get us on the right path so that we're not making foolish mistakes. Then he says, for as the crackling of thorns under a pot, and the idea here is, like a campfire, you're cooking something and you've got a pot and it's over a fire, and you're using thorns as a fuel for that fire. He says, for as the crackling of thorns under a pot, he says, so is the laughter of a fool. The crackling of thorns, the fire it's burning, you hear the crackling of the fire and it's making a sound, but that's all it is it's a sound. And the idea of the thorn, well, it occurred to me, you throw, other kinds of wood into a fire, it's going to burn a bit longer. Thorns, apparently, they burn up quickly. And so, as the crackling of thorns, it may provide heat there for a short time, but it is a short time. They burn up quickly, and it's just a sound that has little significance. And so he says, so is the laughter of a fool. He says, what a fool laughs at, what he finds to be humorous, what he finds funny. He says it doesn't last very long. And he says this also is vanity, and the word vanity there means vapor. It means it's gone. It doesn't last any significant amount of time. And so he's saying the sounds of fools are no more substantial or significant than a vapor that quickly dissipates. All right, so verse 7, he says, surely oppression maketh a wise man mad, and a gift destroyeth the heart. All right, so he says, this verse is showing how both adversity and prosperity can tempt even a wise man to abandon his wisdom and his morals. Because he says, surely oppression maketh a wise man mad. The word wise there, it means skillful, shrewd, prudent, somebody that normally knows what they're doing, who's intelligent. But it says oppression, when somebody is oppressing you, they are taking advantage of you, they are doing you wrong, and presumably you can't do anything or much about it. He says, surely oppression, when somebody's pushing you like that, he says, it can make a wise man mad. And by mad, he doesn't mean angry. Mad, the Hebrew word there means to make a fool of, or it can mean to make into a fool, to make him act foolishly. And so normally a wise man would be, do the wise thing. But here he says oppression can make a wise man mad, make him act foolishly, make a fool out of him. So a wise man might be tempted to fight fire with fire, and because he's being oppressed, he's being done wrong, and so the natural thing for we all tend to want to, if somebody does us wrong, we want to do them wrong. We want to return the favor to them and come back against them in a way that similar to way they did us. But that's an unacceptable response when it comes to God, and it's an unwise response. Romans 12:17 says, recompense no man evil for evil, providing things honest in the sight of all men. And then 1 Thessalonians 5:15, he says, see that none render evil for evil unto any man, but ever follow that which is good, both among yourselves and to all men. So he's saying, our human nature takes over. Oppression makes a wise man mad. He will be tempted to do the foolish thing, to abandon his wisdom, to abandon his morals and doing what is right, and try to get revenge or recompense on the person who's oppressing him. Now, on the other hand, that's when a wise man under adversity. But then he says, and a gift destroyeth the heart. This gift refers to a bribe, where normally this wise man would be doing the right thing and being, fair in what he does. But he says, a gift destroyeth the heart. A gift tempts you to destroy your own integrity, because you instead of doing the right thing, you're tempted to do what this person who's giving you the bribe, what they want you to do. And so instead of being somebody who stands on truth and righteousness, you've made yourself available to the highest bidder. And so whether you're being oppressed, oppression can tempt you to not do the right thing, and this is a gift destroyeth the heart. A bribe can tempt you to abandon your morals and not do the right thing. Verse 8, he says, better is the end of a thing than the beginning thereof, and the patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. All right, so the first pair of opposites here, he says, better is the end of a thing than the beginning thereof. Because when you get to the end of a project, let's say, or a task that has to be done, it's better to be at the end of it because it's completed. All the work is done. You can actually finally rest. You can enjoy the benefits. I mean, if you're building a house or rebuilding a car engine or whatever, it's better to be at the end of it because now it's complete. All the problems have been solved. You don't have to work any more at it. Now you can enjoy the benefit. If it's a house that you've just built, you can move in and enjoy the house. If it's a car engine that you've built, now you can drive the car. I mean, Psalmist says it's better to be at the end than the beginning, because at the beginning you still got all that work ahead of you. You've got problems that could still potentially crop up, and whether or not you finally succeed in finishing it, that's still in doubt. And so he says it's better to be at the end of a project than at the beginning. Then he says, and the patient in spirit is better than the proud in the spirit. The word patient there, the Hebrew word means to be slow to anger. And so those who are slow to anger, they're better able to remain in control of themselves and of their circumstances, because the opposite, like the proud, they think everything has to be done their way, the way they say it ought to be done, the way they want it to be done. And they get angry. They easily become angry when it doesn't get done the way they think it ought to be done. And so then they lose control of themselves. In fact, when we talk about losing your temper, it basically means you've lost control of your emotions. And so Solomon's saying, being patient, being slow to anger, keeping in control and composure, control of yourself, that's so much better than being proud in spirit, where what other people think of you dictates your emotional state. All right, verse 9, he says, be not hasty in thy spirit to be angry, for anger resteth in the bosom of fools. All right, here he's still continuing this idea of being angry. And so he says, do not be hasty in thy spirit to be angry. Don't be quick to lose your temper. Don't be quick to become angry. Don't let other people make you be the trigger to make you angry. Because he says, he's saying being quick to anger is a characteristic of fools. He says, for anger resteth in the bosom of fools. The word resteth there, it means to remain or to reside. And so he's basically saying fools, they have anger residing within them. It's in their heart, it's in their bosom, and it's there, and it doesn't take much to get it to rise to the surface. Very little provocation to make a fool angry. And so he says, don't be hasty in thy spirit to be angry. Why? Because you're acting like a fool if you become angry. Some people become angry at the drop of a hat. It doesn't matter. It doesn't take much to make them angry. And Solomon's saying that's the characteristic of a fool. You need to keep your anger in check. Don't let other people trigger you like that. Verse 10, he says, say not thou, what is the cause that the former days were better than these? For thou dost not inquire wisely concerning this. We have a tendency to think back on what we call the good old days. And we think like, oh, well, things was so much better back in the good old days. We act like the good old days didn't have the same kind of problems that we have today. Well, somebody has said that the longing for the good old days comes from a combination of a bad memory and a good imagination. And the good old days that we call them, they may have had different problems, but they were still problems back then. And so Solomon says, don't say, what is the cause, or why were the former days better than these? Why were the good old days so good? And he says, you're not inquiring wisely. He says, when you ask that question, he says, it's not a wise question, because the good old days weren't all that good. We just don't remember all the little problems that bug us to death today. You had them back then too. All right, verse 11, he says, wisdom is good with an inheritance, and by it there is profit to them that see the sun. For wisdom is a defense, and money is a defense, but the excellency of knowledge is that wisdom giveth life to them that have it. All right, so he says here, wisdom is good with an inheritance, and by it there is profit to them that see the sun. Them that see the sun is those who are alive that are able to see the sun. And the word profit there, it means an advantage or a benefit. And so he says wisdom is good with an inheritance. He says, it's good to be wise, and if you have an inheritance, if somebody has given you money, either somebody you inherited it from good old Uncle Albert or whoever. But that inheritance has a limited benefit to you unless you incorporate wisdom in how you use it. Because there have been a lot of people, more than what you might think, of people who have won the lottery, and a few years they went back and looked at some of these people a few years after they won the lottery, and they're in worse financial shape then than they were before. Why? Because they used the money foolishly. They just blew it. They didn't use wisdom in how they used their money. And so Solomon's saying, look, wisdom is good with an inheritance. He says that's, the money is great. He says, but if you don't use wisdom, it's not going to. It'll benefit you a whole lot more if you use it wisely than if you don't. Because look what he says next line here. He says, for wisdom is a defense and money is a defense. The word defense there, it means a shadow or a shade. In other words, it can shelter you, just like like getting under a shade tree shelters you from the hot sun. He says, wisdom can be a shade to shelter you from the problems of life, the things of life that you might need help with. He says, look, wisdom is a defense. Wisdom will help you be a shelter from these things, and money can be a defense or a shelter or a shade from these things. But then notice what he says next. He says, but the excellency of knowledge is that wisdom giveth life to them that have it. He's basically saying the excellency of knowledge, or the most excellent thing that you can know, is that wisdom giveth life to them that have it. Money alone isn't the answer for everything. He says, money's great. It'll help you get further down the road, but if you have wisdom incorporated, it will magnify the benefit of that money. And so he says it's wisdom that gives life. It's not money that gives life. He says it's wisdom that gives life to them that have it. All right, verse 13. I better hurry here. He says, consider the work of God, for who can make straight that which he hath made crooked? In the day of prosperity be joyful, but in the day of adversity consider. God also hath set the one against the others, to the end that man should find nothing after him. All right, so he says, consider the work of God. In other words, look for the hand of God, recognize the hand of God. When you look at what's happening in your life, what's happening in other people's lives, he says, consider the work of God. Look to see what God is doing there. He says, for who can make straight that which he hath made crooked? We see something we would consider to be crooked, like, oh, well, that's not right. That shouldn't be that way. We should fix it. And we always think that we can fix things. But he says, if God has made something crooked, do you think you can make it straight? He says, consider whether or not God's hand. I mean, sometimes things become crooked because we as human beings, we make stupid choices, and we make ourselves crooked because because of our foolish choices. But sometimes, through no fault of our own, things become crooked, and you got to look and say, well, God, is that you? Did you do that? Because if something is crooked because it's God's will that it be crooked, who are we to think that we can straighten it out? And so he says, in the day of prosperity, he says, be joyful. But in the day of adversity, consider. The word consider means to observe. It means to pay attention. So he says, in the day of prosperity, be joyful. If God has given you prosperity, a period of time that things are going great, he says, be joyful. In other words, appreciate it, be glad for it, enjoy it. But he says, in the day of adversity, when things start going wrong, if you're going through a problem that you're like, why is this happening to me? He says, consider, observe it, pay attention to it. See if you can see what God is doing in your life, because you might be reaping the rewards of your sin, or God may be giving you an opportunity to grow spiritually, because God will use adversity in our lives to help us learn to trust him. Because I went through a period of unemployment, and I learned I had to trust God, because they were everything I was trying to do seemed like the door would shut and things just wasn't working out. But I finally had to say, Lord, you put me where you want me to be, and he found me a job. And so he says, enjoy it when the day of prosperity be joyful. He says, but in the day of adversity consider. Look for God's hand and see what is God doing in your life. What does he want you to learn from this? And he says, God hath set the one over against the other, to the end that man should find nothing after him. The end, the word there means the reason or the purpose. What's the reason that God is doing what he's doing? He says, God also has set the one against the other. And that's an expression, putting something one against the other. It means, putting one thing right beside another thing. It's nearby. And so God, he's Solomon's saying, God gives us days of prosperity. He gives us days of adversity. And God is giving us both. And he says the end or the purpose, the reason that he's doing that, he says that man should find nothing after him. And the idea seems to be that God doesn't want men to think, well, I know what the future is. I've done X, Y, and Z, and therefore, like I've invested all this money, or I've spent my career in college, and now I'm going to do this job, or make lots of money, or whatever. Like we make our plans, and Bible talks about how making plans is a good thing, but we don't know what the future is. We don't know what the future holds. So we have to trust God. God gives us prosperity, and he also gives us adversity because he's wanting to teach us that in the end, we have to trust him, our future. He holds our future, not ourselves. That where we go, where we end up is ultimately in his hands. And I may have time for another verse or two here. He says, all things have I seen in the days of my vanity. He says, there is a just man that perisheth in his righteousness, and there is a wicked man that prolongeth his life in his wickedness. So Solomon says, look, in all my days, he says, I've seen all sorts of things, and he gives us a sample here. He says, there's a just man that perisheth in his righteousness. In other words, a just man, he's righteous, he does the right thing, he lives right, and yet he perishes, he dies. He dies a short life. He dies prematurely. And then he says, on the other hand, there's a wicked man that prolongeth his life in his wickedness. We naturally would think, well, God's going to make sure that the righteous man lives a long life, and that the wicked man, he's the one that dies prematurely. But Solomon says, look, I've seen it the other way around. The righteous live a short life, and the wicked live a long life. And then he says in verse 16, he says, be not righteous over much, neither make thyself over wise. Why shouldest thou destroy thyself? He says, be not over much wicked, neither be thou foolish. Why shouldest thou die before thy time? All right, so I've pondered on this for even after I put my notes on the website, but I kind of think I've kind of evolved in my understanding here. But he says, be not righteous over much. And your first thought is like, well, how can you be overly righteous? Righteous, God would want us to be as righteous as we possibly can. But if you see the context, like verse 20, he tells us, that there is no righteous, that we're all sinners, that we're all, there's no one that doesn't sin. And so it's impossible for us to be overly righteous. But he says, be not righteous over much, neither make thyself over wise. Most commentators, I think, look at it and they say, well, he's talking about being self-righteous, making yourself as if you are more righteous than you really are, much like the Pharisees that Jesus had to deal with. Or being over wise, trying to act like you're smarter than what you really are. And he says, why shouldest thou destroy thyself? When we start relying on our righteousness, he says we're not relying on Jesus Christ and his righteousness. And at the same time, he says, be not overly wicked, neither be thou foolish, for why shouldst thou die before thy time? Being excessively wicked and foolish will definitely shorten your life. And I know that's the second bell. And he says, verse 18, he says, it is good that thou takest hold of this. Yea, also from this withdraw not thine hand. In other words, this is good advice for you to pay attention to listen to, live your life by. You know, don't be self-righteous. Don't be wicked. Because reality for most of us is in between, because none of us, we can't be overly righteous because we're all sinners. He's just saying don't go to the other extreme. So he says, it's good you take hold of this. He says, for he that feareth God shall come forth of them all. You know, to go one way, to rely on your self-righteousness, or to be wicked, will end up in your destruction. But he says, he that feareth God will come forth of them all. And he says, wisdom strengtheneth the wise more than 10 mighty men which are in the city. He says, look, you need to be wise, because that's wisdom will give you strength more, where you're of more benefit than 10 mighty men that are defending the city. And then he says, verse 20, he says, for there is not a just man upon the earth, that which doeth good and sinneth not. He says, look, we're all sinners. You know, so there's no point in trying to be overly righteous, because you can't do it. If you think you are or act like you are, you're just relying on your self-righteousness. He says, look, we're all sinners. We all need God's grace. All right, so we'll pick up later in Ecclesiastes. We've got one more lesson.